Welcome to welcome to the latest in our series of the bulk wine talks, and I'm particularly excited to be doing this evenings because we're looking at China and China's importance to the wine world. But before talking about that, I'd like to talk for a moment or two about what we would be doing normally if 2020 wasn't such a weird year. I certainly would be, and I think many of you watching this would be in Amsterdam at the World Bulk Wine Exhibition, WBWE, which to me has become one of my favorite exhibitions of the year. I've been going since the beginning, effectively. I wasn't, whereas a lot of other events I've been invited as a journalist and so on. This is one that when I first heard about it, I thought I really want to go there. And to actually see the reality, it's like, to me, I've always thought about this fair as being opening the hood or the bonnet of a vehicle and seeing the engine and seeing really what makes it work. And you go around the fair and you don't see the glitzy stands that you see at Provine or at Vinitaly, Vinexpo. The stands are more basic. The signage is more basic. Everything it's much more down to earth, and there's no time wasting. There aren't very many journalists. There aren't many people just wandering around. Everybody who's there is there to talk business. And it's where you hear about the latest vintage. You hear about what's selling and isn't selling. And of course, in terms of the wine, you actually see on those tables the chance to blend, to make your own wines that you're going to sell. And people tend to think of bulk wine as being at the bottom end of the scale. And it's when you go to the fair for the first time and you realize that over there there's Chablis and there's Chateauneuf du Pape and there's Australian Shiraz for €5 a litre. You realize it isn't all basic, and a lot of the wine that you're seeing at premium prices with all sorts of labels on it actually come through the bulk market, which, as we know, is about 37% of all wine at the moment. It's treated in bulk in some way or other. So, of course, this year we're not at any of the fairs and we're not in Amsterdam. And what the WBWE have decided to do is two things. One is to replicate the conference sessions, which are always a popular part of the event in Amsterdam, where I'm often very happy to be talking there, and to turn them into these sessions that we're looking at here. And secondly, to try to replicate some of the business encounters that happen. So there is this service called Connect, which actually tries to put together the exhibitors, or many of the exhibitors who would be in Amsterdam, with the people who will be visiting. So you can actually go in there, sign up, and say, I'm looking for Pinot Noir of this style or whatever, and be put in contact with somebody who's got wines of that kind. So it's almost like a broking exercise, but without a broker's percentage. So if you're interested in if you need wine, and you're looking for particular styles, go and take a look at that. Anyway, to tonight's subject, we're looking at Chinese wine, as I said, and I'm delighted to have Jörg Philipp, who is somebody we've met here and there across the world. But Jörg is someone who, based in Germany, but spends a huge amount of time in China. And that's where we've actually bumped into each other sometimes at events there, doing all sorts of work in terms of consultancy, communication. He was just telling me he took a whole group of wine people around China last year when I was going around in a different direction of China doing some other work. And both of us have experienced all sorts of different facets of the Chinese picture. The first thing I'm going to say before we kick off this conversation is, if anybody tells you that they are really, they know everything about the Chinese wine market, my advice to you is walk away. Don't waste your time. Nobody knows everything about the Chinese wine market. My friends in Shanghai and Beijing and Ningxia and all the other cities I can name, none of them know everything that's happening in China, because if you knew everything that was happening in China yesterday, you're probably out of date today. It's changing so fast. And if you knew what was happening in one city, you probably don't know what's happening in another city. And if you knew what's happening with Chinese wine, you don't necessarily know what's happening in imported wine. And then that brings us into the picture of bottled wine and bulk. So China is an extraordinarily complicated and complex picture, like wine itself. And I'd like to start with that. And I'd like to invite Jörg to chip in to say, Jörg, how do you see the picture of the Chinese wine market today? Not just bulk, but bulk and bottle.
Hi, Robert. First of all, very nice to meet you here on this platform. First of all, I want absolutely to agree with you that if somebody tells you China is easy and everything is clear and I know everything about China, the better walk away. Because technically this is, like you say, not possible. China is, I got sometimes into trouble with writing that there is no Chinese wine market and people get angry. Because what they don't understand is that I don't say that there is no wine market. I simply say that there is no China that is unified. I go to the north, I go to the south, I go to Shanghai, which is like an own market. I go to Beijing. So all of these markets have their own mechanisms and all of them are working in their own way. If I want to work stable and really good in a market, I need to be present in one of them. This is why I talk really about Chinese markets.
So I think that in a way, the way I can try to make sense of that, one of the things I get very angry, your wife is Chinese, so I'm sure she will have a view on this, but it's when I hear anybody from the West coming into China and saying, here is my wine, it goes well with Chinese food. And I think, okay, would you actually come, how would you feel about someone who flew in from California and say, hey, I've got this wine that goes well with European food? So are you talking about paella, or are you talking about pasta, or are you talking about French
pork noodles?
Right? So China, you have, and to me, I think there are parallels with America in a way, where the America, anybody who knows about the US market knows it's not one market. The beauty of China, though, is we can move the thing that I think is very important for people to understand, and it's the difference between China and India, for example, is you can move wine, you can move anything from one corner of China to another corner of China with no barriers.
Right. That's as soon as the wine is in the country, you can move it.
And that's different. So you don't have any kinds of tax or regulatory barriers between, and that is, it's reflected in the efficiency of their online, of their e-business. You can be in the furthest corner in the north and you can order something from through WeChat or through Alibaba or any of the systems, and it will arrive
or whatever
from somewhere,
the platforms. Yeah.
Instant. So, now let's look at the history of China a little bit, and I think bulk will become very important to this, because the Chinese history of wine isn't that old in terms of grape wine as we know about it. Really go back to the 1970s, 60s and 70s, there wasn't much happening. It kicks off with some of the cognac companies wanting to get into China, sell more cognac, and there was a kind of let's get involved with production of wine, usually white wine in those days, interestingly, all those first wines. And then we had Deng Xiaoping with his reform, wanting to get people, and I think he said, as I recall, when China will have money, they'll spend it on alcohol and gambling. And gambling is, of course, mahjong, or not just mahjong, but particularly mahjong. But they'll spend money on alcohol, and that would have been Baijiu. And Baijiu is the spirit that is a national drink. Let's talk a little bit about Baijiu. How important is Baijiu in China?
In terms of volume, I think it makes over 90% of the really alcohol market. Meaning that if you talk about alcohol in this term and you compare with wine, if you don't know really about Baijiu, you don't really know about that there's a alcohol market in China. Also, if you talk to media,
Baijiu versus wine, how do they break down?
Baijiu, if you look at it, for example, if you take media and you look at media, what they are working with, you can say that they are working like 95% what they are working as Baijiu, and maybe 3-5% will be what they are working with wine. So
and
the
what
importance.
Is Baijiu? Let's define
Baijiu itself is spirit. The spirit is made out of different grain kinds. Very often people talk about rice wine, but it's technically not correct.
It's sorghum, isn't it?
you use a lot of course. You use wheat kinds, use whatever is available in the region, and then you ferment it. Just means enzymatically you break it up, and then afterwards you distill it.
And
this makes
me,
over 50% of alcohol. The drink is also important to know. It's like 53
I think
is the
firstly
typical.
the strength is important. The second thing is it goes from every price point. You can buy it for not much more than water, certainly cheaper than wine, and you can pay hundreds of euros for a bottle of Baijiu in a smart bottle. And I think we don't understand that. I think the other thing is when you go through a train station or an airport, everywhere what you see is Baijiu advertising.
Yeah.
And Baijiu, the interesting thing about Baijiu is the margin, the profit margin and the marketing budgets are huge. And there are not many wines that compete with that.
Right. Especially if you also now look for brands. Then you will see people easily know Baijiu brands, a lot of them, everywhere. They have their preference, they know them, they know if this is more a fruity style, if this is an earthy style or whatever. If you go to wine, how many different brands very likely will be named if you have this question? You might have...
And beer... Sorry.
Yeah, you might have there 2 or 3 wine brands that are named, and then that's it.
Now, talking to you as a German, beer historically is not as strong as either Baijiu or wine is now, is it, in terms of branding and visibility?
It is. Actually, beer is very, very important on the Chinese market.
But you don't see, my point is invisibility. They drink a lot of beer, but you don't see the beer brands in the way you see the Baijiu brands.
Yes, you see.
Not as many.
You see
not
them,
not
in TV.
just of the market. Yeah, but the marketing in terms TV.
It's more TV marketing. It's really on TV. You see them all the time. So I agree that if you say, okay, now in media or similar, you don't see it in the same way. But of course, you have them all the time on TV.
Yeah, but in terms of the alcohol companies, Baijiu is this. In terms of the government links and so on, Baijiu is crucially important.
Right.
So now we go back to our history of the explosion of wine production from the 70s and 80s and on. Mm-hmm. Right, China is not, it's not an easy place to make wine. It gets very cold in the winter. You have to bury the vines to protect them against the cold. Mm-hmm. Under the earth, it's a good way to incubate disease. And actually, the early examples of wine from China were not very good. And how did they make those wines that they were trying to sell taste better? They brought in bulk. So from the first foundations of the Chinese wine industry, and the same is true in Canada, also is true, same was true in Japan, these were places that relied on bulk imports to sell wine that was pretending to be Chinese. Is that correct?
At the end, it's correct. I mean, the point was how to get wine that is very suitable for the market. So there were own productions. The own productions might sometimes not fit or not be enough. And then they started really to import bulk. And also, if you talk to certain producers of wine, actually, and you say, yeah, but now you have wine that comes from somewhere else, and you are blending it with your wine. Does this really match? Can this be? And they say, look, the most important for me is that actually people like the wine. So for me, it's not if it's Chinese or if it's from other countries. It's simply that people like what I'm doing.
But I think the other point to make is that back in the day, you could buy drinkable wine from France, Chile, Argentina, Australia, anywhere it was, for 50 cents, for example. And the production cost in China was higher than that. And you were dealing with farmers, you were dealing with everything else. So you were making wine that didn't taste very good in China that cost you more than the imported bulk.
Right.
And so
it's simply that you take a product and you, like in most countries, and you say, okay, I need a product. The production costs here are this high. Where else can I get the product at the price point that I'm looking for?
It's ironic. So we're making our trainers and our clothes in China because it's cheaper to make them in China. The Chinese were making their wine from imported components. But I remember a Chinese winemaker who drove a long way to see me in Beijing, and she brought me 2 wines, 2 examples of, these were tank samples, and she said, she's a lovely lady, she said, would I tell her which of the 2 I liked best? And I said, well, I like number one better, but I'd like to ask, why are they made from the same grapes? And she said, more or less. I said, were they picked at the same time? More or less. I said, were they made in the same way? More or less. I said, well, it's very hard for me to say, but I number one is richer, riper, more intensity. It's a nicer wine to me. Not great wine, but nicer wine. What's the difference? And she said, it's easy. The Chilean bulk wine in number one was better than the French bulk wine in number two. And what she wanted, the reason she'd driven all the way to see me, was she wanted to tell her boss that she wanted to pay an extra few cents on the Chilean bulk rather than the French bulk, and she wanted a foreign person to support her.
To confirm actually what she was thinking, right?
So bulk has been a big part, but then we get into the development of Chilean Chinese regions, and particularly Ningxia. And there's a lot of politics behind the Ningxia region's background, isn't there? So what's that?
I mean, very often what is important to understand is that what a region lives from. And there are certain regions that live from, for example, mining, which Ningxia was. Ningxia was a typical region that was living from mining. This got more or less important. And then the question was how to get people stable and people living there. And then the point was to get more agriculture into an area that is feeded from the Yellow River.
It's a desert. I mean, you've been there and I've been there. There's nothing.
It's desert. And there are certain areas in the south, for example, of Ningxia that have been made out of the desert. So there was nothing at all. And it was really completely built up from zero, from the scratch.
And when there are parallels.
And then you have the interest of getting people into agriculture and to give them a work in a stable environment. This is what the government very often wants to do. They want to make sure that the population has a stable environment where they can work, they can earn a living, and are also, of course, always very thankful to the government that they made this possible.
So Ningxia, and I think there are parallels in that we could look at in the West in terms of Washington State. There are areas of Washington State where you could not grow anything without irrigation. It's a pretty dry, arid place, and the same thing applies here. So we've got we've got cities, people living there well, and they start to create companies, private companies or state-connected companies, with some quite high-priced wines in the early days from Ningxia.
They were. Actually, very often it comes that, first of all, it's important to understand the costs for building a winery. If you have the cost for building a winery, very often then you have a very short period that you can get back. The return on investment is quite short. It's not like in Germany, I say, okay, the next 30, 40, 50 years, maybe the next generation will take this over. This is not existing in China. In China, this is a very short period. You try to get back your money, meaning that then, of course, the wine that you produce every year is quite pricey. But
I think also, the reason I wanted to talk a little bit about Baijiu earlier is that anybody who looks at alcohol in China has that background knowledge that there is this spirit that people can make money. Yeah. So why would we not want to do something like that? And that to me
very often, it's that they compare also. Of course, very often it's that you say, okay, I have now high-class wines from France. The first grows are this price. My wine is comparable with it. I produce very great things, so why should I not ask for at least 50, 60, 70% of this price?
So
by the side, of course, that you want to earn money with it, and for Baijiu, like you say, it's possible to earn money with it.
So now let's talk about what happens to the bulk market. And what we've seen in China is bulk goes up and it goes down, it goes up and it goes down, depending on the local vintage, whether they've made enough wine or not, basically the economy, and all sorts of other things that have an implication on the bulk market, as it does in other countries, but I think particularly in China. There is a discussion of where the bulk wine goes, because, and that brings me into brands. Now, I think that China is an interesting country when it comes to relationship with brands. And I think you as a German, Germany has I think, in a way, a different relationship to brands, maybe to China.
So in China, you have famous wineries that, if we now start with the Chinese ones, that are Great Wall and Chengyu, which are the ones that are strong on the market and are considered the biggest ones on the market. And these are brands that are well established and also with governmental background. Great Wall is from COFCO. COFCO is the biggest, let's say, company for nutrition in China. And there, of course, the creation of brands give the possibility to also reach a huge market, because you can easily, as a governmental supported company or governmental linked company, go and find your way to have your wine distributed everywhere. As soon as it comes to other wineries, or let's say foreign wineries that come into China, then the thing starts to get different.
But in a way, I suppose what I'm talking about brands in a broad sense. So the first time I went to China, there was almost no advertising. I'm not talking about wine, I'm talking about any products.
Yeah.
The next time I then went, this is going back to the 1980s, if you like, I began to see advertisements for Western products with Western models.
Yeah.
The next time there were Western names with Eurasian models. Not necessarily obviously Chinese, but not so obviously Western. And then what was fascinating, into the late 1990s, the turn of the century, we've begun to see more and more Chinese brands with Chinese faces. And when you went to the markets, the Silk Road market in Beijing, or the markets in Shanghai, where you went to see the fake products, increasingly, as the government clamped down on your fake Mont Blanc and your fake Hermes and whatever, you began to see more and more real Chinese brands coming up at high prices. And basically, the Chinese like buying branded products in cosmetics and in clothes and everything else. So there's an openness to brands. I think that's an important point. But on the other hand, there are some very, very financially astute distributors who want to make their absolute margin. And how do you make a margin on selling a brand that your competitor is selling the same brand for a lower price?
Yeah.
Especially, and I think this is something else that's interesting in China, is the Chinese are very, very good at taking around their phone and checking the QR code or the barcode on the product in a store and saying, oh, I can get this cheaper somewhere else. So, and that's something I've seen happen more in China than I've seen anywhere in the world. So that means that the distributor wants one of two things. He either wants exclusivity of the product, of the branded product, or he wants a private label. And when I'm at any of the bottled wine fairs, that's what I hear a lot from Chinese importers. Okay, I like your product. Can I have exclusivity? And then the producer says, no, you can't. And then he goes, okay, will you do private label? Oh, yeah. And then that moves us into bulk questions of whether we're shipping the bulk or whether they're buying bottled. Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. If you look, some years ago already, I got the information that there are around 100,000 different wine brands in China.
Yeah.
Meaning that you have a lot of labels, which could be the same wine with a different label, or which could really be wines that are exclusively made or produced for somebody that is looking for something special in his region. It's true. It's true that you can even have a picture, or you can take a picture of any product that you like in China, and then an app will tell you where to find exactly this product, at which price. And then it's always the same problem. Of course, you try to place your product, and then you figure out the wine. Neighbor is selling it, the other neighbor is also selling it. As soon as one neighbor figures out this is really running good, they also want to distribute it. And then you run into a situation that is leaving you quite small margins. What in China nobody likes. In China, if you do something, you want to do it and you want really to earn money with it.
So we'll talk about fake wines in a minute, because it's a big subject. And I think we'll talk about ownership of brands in a minute. But both of those are not necessarily absolutely relevant to the bulk market as I see it. They may be, but they're not. If we're shipping wine, so let's say I'm standing in Amsterdam at the fair, and I've got, I mean, I produce wine in southern France, and if somebody comes along and says to me, I would like to buy X volume of let's say my Shiraz Grenache blend or my Cabernet blend from southern France, and we're going to ship it in bulk and bottle it in China, and we'll do it as an OEM, or we'll do it with your name on it or a different name. How do we feel about that as a project?
In first line, it's always important to understand how the wine will arrive in China. Meaning it will arrive in China, and as soon as it arrives the winery and it goes to customs, it's a Chinese product. Meaning that if it's bottled, afterwards it's bottled in China and it's a produce or product of China. Of course, you can mention nice things on the front label. So you can indicate, okay, this is a wine from, and so on, and you can try to work around on the front label. But at the end, on the back label, and this is what most of the people understand, because very few people can read very often the front labels. So they look on the back label, and on the back label they see, this is a produce from China, it's bottled in China. That's it.
So that's it. So there is an interesting, to me, gap between bottled overseas and bottled in China. Because there is a trust for bottled overseas, quite often that there isn't for bottled in China. And that brings me through to the fakes. And one of the things that we haven't understood, I think, in the West about fake wine in China is that we are always obsessed with fake bottles of Chateau Lafite or fake bottles of Romani Conti with Rudy Coney wine in America or whatever. In China, when they think of fake, they very often think of fake milk, of fake basic products which have been poisonous. In China, people when they fake things, people die, and it's not a question of buying a Bordeaux that isn't quite as good or it's not as good as Chateau Lafite. It may well be something that will kill you, and so in a sense, the packaged outside China comes with a greater guarantee, or not guarantee, but a greater security than packed in China. Is that fair?
It's really like this. This means very often people prefer products that are already produced in overseas. Certain countries have certain, let's say, for example, if you go and you look at the market, it's Korea and Japan are for cosmetics. Then you go to other countries like Australia, very often you have milk products and so on. This is also, of course, from like Germany, Netherlands, and people trust more in products that come already packed into China, like you say, for health topics. Very often they are afraid that this might not be the same quality standards when it's produced or when it's in case bottled in China, that it will be, if you buy the product or you bottle it simply in another country that is outside of China. It's like
so this. That says that if I'm going to sell my wine in bulk to China, I'm kind of accepting that it's going to end up either in a blend with Chinese wine, as Chinese wine, or even if it has the fact that it's Italian and French on the outside, it will be effectively treated as a Chinese product once it's in China.
It's like this.
But that raises an interesting question of what's happened with Australia, which we have to talk about, because we have suddenly this huge tariff on Australian wine as part of the battle over COVID. Ostensibly over what's happened with COVID, but it's not.
I think this was the last kick when it started. Yeah.
Now, one of the interesting things, and I have the statistics that somebody sent me the other day, which was fascinating in terms of what the actual value of Australian wine to China. And Australia, actually, the first thing is that most of the wine going from Australia to China is in bottle. It's 84% has gone in bottle. By the way, all statistics about China we have to question a little bit, to be fair. So there are a lot of them, but they're not necessarily always accurate. And if we go back to the 1980s, when there wasn't much volume, it was the value per liter was about less than $2, and sometimes as low as $1. And in recent times, the Chinese have been paying $5.80 a liter. That's bulk and bottle on average, compared to the US, which has been paying $2.16 for Australian wine, and the UK, which has been paying $1.16 on average. So you can see that China has been a very, very interesting market for Australia. And interestingly, a greater percentage of the wine going to China has been in bottle than it's been done to the UK or Australia or the US. But the big question really is, what have they been buying when they've been buying Australian wine, and why has Australia been so successful?
I think there are two topics. One is branding, because Penfolds was very strong, or Penfolds really managed to give a very good Chinese name also on the market, which people recognized and people afterwards liked to buy. They made a very good marketing there, and they opened probably also markets for, let's say, others. On the other side, it was to import Australian wine in a certain volume also opened you the possibility to get Australian nationality or green card there. Meaning that in this moment, you have two things. You have one thing that is a brand that helps to come into a market. And on the other side, you have a government that allows you, by making business with Australia, like wine, to get a certain benefit that you are interested in, because you might want that your children go to study to Australia, or you have a company in Australia which also allows you to make business again back to China, and so on.
I think the other thing that I can say, maybe some of my Chinese friends might not be saying in public, is that we have people in China who want to get money out of China. And in the past, they were buying chateaus in Bordeaux. They were being various way. Wine has been associated with getting money out. So if you've got a way of getting a green card into Australia where you can do business there. So you've had all sorts of people who are in businesses with nothing to do with wine, who have suddenly bought $50,000, $100,000 worth of wine, or invested in some sort of wine business or whatever, in order to have that kind of paperwork that allows them to do more in Australia.
And it's also very important in China to understand that this leads to a sharp movement in the business. Talking to wine associations, we figured out that actually the importers, also distributors in China, change every year in around 50%. This means every year 50% of distributors or importers are disappearing, and new ones are coming into the market. Like you say, simply because they come from other business, then in case suddenly wine is fancy, or it might be that they have other economically interests, or interest in getting money, or interest in getting certain, as I say, nationalities. And then you do wine not really as a passion, or you do not wine because it's something that is interesting for you and you were moving already for years. Wine is for your business. And it will be treated like every other product too. There is no difference.
I think the other thing that's fascinating is that compared to anywhere else that I know, you never know who you are dealing with. So if you are in many countries, you will meet somebody and they are, I'm a wine importer, or I'm a spirits importer moving into wine or whatever. In China, you will find somebody who's in the business of machine tools or air conditioning. And for whatever reason, they've moved into wine. And that leads us into another area that we need to know about, which is, of course, historically, before 2011, 12, 13, wine was almost a currency in terms of gifting and banquets and so on between government-owned and run companies. So essentially, because you have huge numbers of banquets towards the end of the year, New Year, and you have gifts, my government-owned company would buy the wine from the government-owned winery.
Yeah.
And we would both know each other, and that got stopped. Not really. It got slowed down by President Xi.
Really intensively slowed down.
Yeah. The thing that we didn't know about, that wasn't talked about at the time, though, was that in the West, we thought, oh, isn't it a disaster for wine because the Chinese government is clamping down? Actually, the pipes were full before that happened. So it was actually doing a favor. If that hadn't happened, there would have been an explosion of unsold wine anyway. So that's one of the things I would say about China, which is again relevant to bulk and bottle, is that it's a boom-bust market. Mm-hmm. Where you tend to find when wine is going well, a lot of people get into wine and buy wine, and then suddenly the warehouses are full, and then you get to a point where it stops. So that, to me, talking to my friends in the industry, in the distribution and in the industry in China, there's a general belief that the market will double in the next 10 years. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Maybe. But it won't go in a straight line. It's going to do that on its way up. So anybody who's going to be on that ride, they have to hold on, because they're going to go down and up, and it's going to be a very bumpy journey.
And this is actually what we always also try to explain all of the, let's say, people that want to work with China, especially wineries, that there is no easy way to go into China. Like you said, you have big companies and they might have 100 employees, then suddenly they start to do a little bit of wine. 4 employees of the 100 suddenly do wine. So it's a small fraction of it. And it will be they look at it, if it's interesting, they will continue it. If it's not interesting, they will simply stop, and the 4 people work again for the, let's say, main business, and that's it. So meaning that you start with somebody that you think, wow, this is now really good, and they are moving wine and they are doing something with me, then they realize, oh, actually it's not so interesting in terms of return of money that we get or the benefit that we can have, and then they simply stop it. And then it disappears again for you. This means you might be on the market and you go slowly up, but it can always be like it's going, like you say, up and down. So it will go up, but always in case hard steps.
I think the other thing to say is, in terms of China, you talked about it being not one country. It is city by city by city, and you really need to be identified. And the north is not the same as the south. I think there are big differences. Climatically, that has an effect. There are some cities that are more industrial, some that are more agricultural. And all these cities, to me, as a visitor, and I've only visited, I must have been to 12 or 15 cities outside Shanghai. I mean, you go to Shanghai, Beijing, Chengdu, Guangzhou, and then you start to go to the others that people haven't heard of and don't know, and you start to really see that they all, essentially from the outside, they look the same because they've got the same apartment blocks. Maybe it's an old city in the middle, but essentially they all have their own characters, don't they?
They have. So if you go in the region and you find these old areas, you will see that all of them have a different way of construction. All of them have a different way of food. There are really interesting food areas around China. They find some bigger areas, but if you go into a small city again, you figure out that they again have their own style of making business. One interesting meeting I had was of a company that was based in Beijing, and they wanted to make business in Guangzhou. And at the end of the meeting, then we had dinner. And then the guy from Beijing was like, I don't understand these people from Guangzhou. Meaning that even within China, it's for them sometimes very intensive and very difficult to make business between each other because the culture is so different.
But that's not untrue. I've had that situation between Boston and Texas on occasion. So, and certainly between northern Italy and southern Italy, and there are other places that I think we need to look at it a little bit in those terms, maybe amplified. Now, the question that we were asked to address that we haven't addressed, I guess, is the pandemic an opportunity for wine into China? And, well, I've got my own. How easy a question is that to answer, Jörg?
Let's say this way, I don't know if the pandemic itself is now a reason to be more interesting for bulk into the country. I think what makes bulk interesting for China more and more is that very often, due to certain economic situations or situations in between China and certain countries, it's more interesting to move bulk, to simply don't get into trouble with tariffs, don't get into trouble with, let's say that your wine is blocked in customs because certain things are missing. So China has a certain interest to have wine in the country, China is also supporting very often bottling lines. This means they support companies that are really bottling in China. And I think this is the point that makes it very interesting to bottle in China, that the government has a certain interest in this, because you create business within China, you create jobs within China. So they have interest to do it like this.
So if we look at looking at what President Trump did to European wine last year by his 25% tariff, that did not apply to bulk wine. So that's something that a lot of people didn't notice. If we look at what's happening to Australia today, does the tariff affect bulk wine? Doesn't. No. It's actually on bottled wine. So this is an interesting situation for Australian companies who are going to be thinking quite a lot about whether they should be looking at it in this way. I think that bulk into China is a little bit like, to me, like supplying European supermarkets with private label. It may not be what you want to do most. It may not be your best margin builder. But if you are seen as being, if Aldi and Lidl, for argument's sake, as a discounter, or if any of the other Tesco's, Carrefour, see you as a reliable supplier of bulk wine. And we had last week Bernard Fontenez from Origin in South Africa talking about very positively about bulk for his business, and he has bottled wine as well. If you can have that relationship with a retailer, it can be a good thing. And presumably the same thing applies if you've got a Chinese winery that takes your bulk and likes what you're supplying and you are straight with them. You can actually have some quite good long-term relationships, can't you?
It's also very often like this. So there are many wineries that are working already now for decades with certain big, like Kofco, or in this case, Great Wall. So I know Spanish wineries that are providing already now for 15, 20 years. Always stable there. I mean, as you say, it always goes up and down a little bit. If there's too much on the market, then it might be less. If there's missing, it might get more. If sometimes also then the prices somewhere else are much cheaper, it might also shift a little bit to another country. But at the end, you have a stable market working there for you.
And I think the final thing, because I'm looking at our time, I think we're probably, I don't know any questions. Christina's watching questions on the questions coming in on YouTube. But I think one of the things I would say that is crucial to me from anybody that in conversations I've had about China is how often Westerners, outsiders, underestimate. They underestimate the knowledge that the Chinese buyers already have. Because very often they don't show off what they know, but you realize afterwards how much that they know behind the scenes. Secondly, the speed at which they're learning. Not knowing is embarrassing. So they want to the moment that they've discovered they're ignorant, they go away and find out. And I think those things are crucially important, and to actually also understand that at a level where the people don't know, the people I was meeting when I was going around these second, third tier cities, wine is quietly becoming part of life. You see it on the soap operas. You see it in lots of cultural places. You go around a shopping mall, and it's quietly in cities that most of us have never heard of outside China. Wine, you don't see it in all the restaurants, but it's beginning to. It's beginning to happen. And I think that the thing that really struck me in recent times has been going into cafes and bars, wine bars, which of course didn't exist in the past, and seeing two young women drinking wine. And that's important because these young women do not want Baijiu. And Baijiu is suffering quite a lot from the fact that the young people don't want it as much as a high-strength alcohol, which they're not drinking in cocktails. They don't want Baijiu. They don't necessarily want beer. And wine fits that very well. And that is now moving from traditionally red wine. We're beginning to see white and sparkling and pink coming in, which you wouldn't have imagined 5-7 years ago.
That's right. I think the market is open up a lot. People are getting more interested. People are traveling a lot. People get to know other cultures. People get to know other things. they come back and they simply have then their own taste, or they might look for something and say, no, I want to have now a glass of rosé. I want to have now a glass of sparkling. So it's also that they might feel more comfortable. One point might be the knowledge that they get about the product. The other thing is that they traveled and they saw also that this is the way that you can drink whatever you like. And this might be, like you said, maybe the market that we should look for in China is exactly these people that are moving from traditional drinks, which might be Baijiu or in case beer, to other things that might be wine, that might be, let's say, new drinks that are based on wine. I think there are a lot of possibilities in China right now.
So we saw this last 2-3 years ago where Penfolds brought in a red wine with Baijiu. And in the West, everybody laughed at it and went, oh, it's crazy, it's awful. It's a very clever drink. For a Chinese buyer, it tastes enough of Baijiu spirit, but it also tastes of wine. I've drunk it a few times. It's not my favorite product, but I can see the quality in it. And we laugh at them, but as we said last week, 12 million bottles last year of red wine in America, aged in bourbon barrels and rum barrels, are being sold in America. What's the difference between flavoring wine with whiskey in America or flavoring it with Baijiu in China? It's the same concept, if you like. And I think you're right. Fruit-flavored wines, all sorts of things will come in. And as that happens, I think wine, people have a more relaxed attitude towards wine. And I'm beginning to see the Chinese companies. But I think what's slow in China is we've taught them that wine has to come in a 75 centiliter bottle with a cork.
Yeah.
You don't see many screw caps yet in China.
And it's still not very fashionable. People don't like.
Yeah.
It's like this.
And I think that when we see more of that, we'll see a more relaxed attitude towards wine. Do we have any questions before we wrap up? Christina, do we have any? Christina, our producer from the Bulk Wine Talks here. I can't see an answer from her. So I think if we don't have any questions, I'd like just to think about some final words on future of wine in China in the next 3, 4, 5 years. Jörg, what do you think is going to, how important do you think wine and China is going to be?
Wine is going to be more important in China in the next 3, 4, 5 years. It will probably also be the way that the Chinese wine gets a higher share of the market. This is why it's also interesting to increase the whole market, because then everybody will benefit from it in the wine business. I think China will go in this way and will try also to make it easier for Chinese wine to enter the market, because it's their own product, and of course they always want to have a stable economy and they want to see their product sold. But I think at the same time, as more people drink wine, they are also more interested to get other things, to drink other things that come from outside. And in this moment, we have a huge market that will start to simply drink wine, which then is not the point if it comes from China, if it comes from Chile, or if it comes from another country. It's simply to get a bigger market that is growing in terms of volume.
I think that's absolutely true. I think the thing I'd also say is, and this is a strange thing to say in 2020 when none of us can go anywhere, but you really do need to go there. You need to spend some time there, and maybe if we can't go there, I've had a few Zoom conversations. It's not always easy, actually, with it depends on the platform you're using. But I think we're going to see more and more communications with parts of China that are not Shanghai and Beijing. That's my biggest advice to people, is whether you can go there or you can find other ways of communication, look beyond the obvious, because those places are very, very saturated, it seems to me.
There are hundreds of cities that have over several million inhabitants.
Yeah. And people with they're driving around in BMWs, and there's a lot of money in those places.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jörg, thank you very much for your time. You're off to China, you hope, in the next...
I hope so.
So
this week I hope we manage. Yeah.
Travel well, and I hope to be there next year if we're all traveling. I hope we are as well. Thank you. Please,
thanks a lot, Robert.
To the audience, please come back. We've got a whole lot of other subjects we're looking at Argentina, which I think is a fascinating subject coming up. And again, one of the great suppliers, and we're looking at Spain, again, one of the other great suppliers of the bulk wine market, but not just bulk. So thank you all very well. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening wherever you are, and I hope to see you over the next few evenings. And please tune in to the YouTube channel to catch up on what we've already done. Thank you.
Take care, all of you.
Take care. Thanks.